The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, my name is Kay Drache, and we're here for a discussion with Anne McCaffrey and Elizabeth Ann Scarborough, who have just returned from the 1994 World Science Fiction Convention in Winnipeg. Welcome. It's good to have you here in Minneapolis.
Well, thank you very much, Kay.
And
Hi, Kay.
hope you've had a little chance to relax since the World Con, where you were guest of honor and you were a guest, and as you said, high profile. My first question today, one that, since I didn't get to go to WorldCon, I'm interested in knowing, is how you met and how you got involved in writing together. You come from science fiction and fantasy, respectively, in your careers, and this is real interesting.
Well, actually, I met Anne the day that I found out that I had sold my first novel. I was living in Alaska, and I was sent down to Kansas City to visit my parents because I was going nuts. I'd had my first novel out out to publishers for 8 months and was waiting for a response. And I saw that Anne was going to be there in the paper. Said to my mother, "Oh, it's an omen. My favorite author's here, and it's the only week I've been in Kansas City in 2 years." And so she said, "Okay, calm down." And we went to Anne's signing, and she was very gracious, and she signed the book. And I went home, and my dad said, "Oh, by the way, my ex-husband called, and you have a letter from Bantam Books." And I said, "Oh, I do. Daddy, is it a letter, or is it like, a package that maybe has a manuscript in it?" He said, "No, it's just a letter." He said, "I think they want to buy it or something." And of course, I was crawling around on the ceiling. And then I immediately tried to call Anne. Well, during the course of talking to her at the signing, I said I was from Alaska, and she said she'd like to go there, so I passed that on when I went home to Alaska. And that's when we really got to know each other.
And then the Fairbanks Art Group Center asked me to be a writer in residence for 10 days, 2 weeks. So I went up in April, and who did I meet? But Annie again. And she took me around to see all the things that she liked in Fairbanks. I got a chance to eat moose meat spaghetti, go on a dog sled ride.
Is it better than it sounds?
Yeah, it is. It's very good, in fact. And I got on a dog sled ride and saw the Aurora Borealising, and went to a marvelous movie about the
Spirit of the Wind.
Spirit of the Wind, which was about the Alaskan sled drivers race. And so I saw more than I might have if I hadn't known Annie.
Sure. And had you started talking about actually collaborating at that point, or was that something that happened down the road?
It's been recent.
Yeah, because that was back in 81 or 82, I think.
Okay. So you've kept up your correspondence and
Well,
your friendship?
Well, but we keep meeting at conventions.
Oh, okay.
Because I've been out in the Northwest quite a bit. And we were out in Moscow, Idaho. And Annie wanted to do some research on a book of Irish music. I said, "Well, come on and visit me."
Yep.
So it worked out a couple of years later. She did.
It sounds like a fanish friendship, one of those. We meet at conventions, so that's where we see each other all the time.
No, we are authors, so it's an author's friendship.
We also meet at conventions because most of the time we're sitting at home behind our word processor.
Well, you mentioned the animals, the dogs, and I know that you have horses and dogs, and and you both have cats who've shown up in a number of your books as an inspiration. And in the introduction to one of your stories, you wrote about your brother Kevin, who astonished some teenagers by being the white-haired inspiration for Kivan, a young character in one of your stories.
Well, I was signing in St. Louis at Kevin's favorite bookshop. And a couple of kids came by, about 11 or 12. "We had to read your book in school." And I said, "Well, did you like it?" It was all right. And I said, "Well, you see that white-haired gentleman out there? He's Kevin." "Him?" I said, "Well, he was young once, too." So I said, "Go get his signature." "You think I should?" "Yeah, go ahead." "Why should I do all the work?" Kevin said, "That was fine. You set me up."
Yeah, well, notoriety, and a little good for them. Are there other people in your lives who served as inspiration for characters in your stories?
Well, yes. I wouldn't actually say all of them because I might get sued for some of them. But this fairy godmother here might not look exactly the same as the lady sitting next to you, but she sort of inspired that character.
Wondered that a little bit, actually.
Yeah.
One of the friends of Elizabeth Ann's was at the convention. Her name is Lee Day, and she is a chief petty officer, and we put her in a book.
Another friend of mine, Tanya Opland, who plays a lot of antique musical instruments, Tanya made, or Annie made into Targia Upland, who is a specialist in antique weapons.
Okay. Okay.
And I met Lessa of Pern 4 years after I created her.
Oh, wow.
And she was a racehorse rider, work rider in Ireland, but she was Lessa.
So you see that kind of synchronicity.
That's unnerving. I mean, you invented them, and then they turn up in real life, and they're very much like the character you portrayed. That's scary.
I guess my most prominent books that I can admit to having real life inspirations for the characters of the Songkiller Saga, because a lot of my friends are musicians. And one of my older friends, Alan Dameron, who's actually just played in Where I Live last night while I was at the convention, inspired the character of Willie Mackay, who's the lead character there.
Do they recognize each other then?
Oh yeah, he brags about it.
Okay.
I don't know if Willie recognizes Alan or not, but Alan recognizes Willie. So.
And you said that you'd memorialized at least one person.
Oh,
too,
yes. We had a very dear young friend in Ireland. He palled around with my sons and my daughter, named Johnny Green. And he went off, like many good Irish lads, and joined the French Foreign Legion. And he worked himself up to Maréchal de Logis, which is equivalent to a sergeant. And one night he went out drinking with a friend and decided to go visit somebody else, and he was murdered, and they never did find out why. And it was rather traumatic for all of us. And I decided, by golly, Johnny's not going to die. He's going to be in every single book I write from now on. He's the hero in Renegades of Pern. He's also mentioned in the latest book, The Dolphins of Pern.
He's the father of...
We have him in our books.
In all of the power lines,
Right.
he's a great
captain.
chopper pilot.
Chopper pilot.
Oh, is that?
Which is more
Okay.
like Johnny.
Well, that's right. His name is Johnny Green. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he comes out, one of his nicknames was Golly Green, so I made him Golly Gren in the Rowan series.
Okay.
And sometimes he appears as a sort of a stupid guy, and sometimes he appears as a baddie, but he's in every book I'll write for the rest of my life. That way I can give Johnny the life he didn't have.
Yeah. You mentioned power lines and powers that be. This is right here, which just came out. Power Lines came out, what, last year, 1993? Yes. Okay, and I understand that there's a third book in the works?
Yep, we just finished Power Play before Annie had to take an airplane back to her cats before they disowned her.
Okay, and that, does it take up right where Power Lines?
Oh yes, they're all continuous.
They're quite close in time together.
Okay, so we can expect to see the same characters and, great.
And a few more.
Yeah.
People say, why do you have so many characters? We say, it's a whole world, come on, you know.
Yeah. I really enjoyed Power Lines and Powers That Be, and I think that they show off the strengths of your collaborative writing. You've got a lot of very interesting, very well-developed characters, both human and animal.
Well, she does the villains.
And sentient, yeah.
Well, not all of them, but by and large, I think that I've, having been in the bottom of power structures for a longer time, maybe than Anne was subjected to it, I've found a lot more material and paid more attention to how they operate and what in particular annoys me about them. And I think that one place we balance each other is that I get discouraged by all of this evilness, you know, or just petty bureaucracy, which is what a lot of it is. And Anne rises above it, and so just about the time I'm getting so discouraged I don't know how to get the characters out of it, she says, I'll take that, and she fixes it, you know.
We have two computers in the house, and they both have the same program. So one of us works on the disk, and then the other one works in the disk.
Yep.
So we can go over each other's work. And at this point in time, except one or two scenes we know we did ourselves, we can't tell who did what.
In fact, we got a review and they were saying, well, this shows Scarborough's da-da-da and McCaffrey's da-da-da, and she was wrong. We'd done just the opposite, you know.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Well, then it really does. You do work very well together.
It's a most fortuitous and felicitous combination.
Yeah.
And the best part of it is you get to the place where normally you would have to stop and think for a week, and all you do is you take it down the hall and say, I'm stuck, it's your turn.
Oh, gee, thanks to peach skin.
But as a matter of fact, there's 10 or 20 pages of fresh new words that you haven't seen before.
And then you
and new
can
story
go
things,
on.
and you can just jam on it, you know.
Yeah.
So it's.
Do you find that it affects your individual work too? Where, like, for Godmother, I mean, you have great villains in Godmother, and I have to say that some of them are really good villains because they're not quite so villainous. I'm thinking of the Huntsman.
Yeah.
The Toad.
Oh, Bobby the Hit Toad, yeah.
Toad, right. Who has a change of heart or realizes which side.
He gets turned into a toad, it changes his life, you know.
And the poor toad ends up in an insane asylum.
Yeah, that was pretty funny.
So you've got this tall, Steven Seagal lookalike hopping around going rivet in the psych unit at Harvard.
Yep.
Meanwhile, you've got this toad with an attitude living in Felicity's pocket, scared to death of Puss the cat. So.
Yeah, that was pretty fun. Healer's War, I wanted to ask you about that. Healer's War, on the other hand, which is the book that came out a number of years ago. I don't remember.
It won the 1989 Nebula.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was going to say. You won the Nebula for it. Has very few. It's got depressing parts. It doesn't really have villains per se. It has some very misguided people in it. And people who are very bigoted. I think particularly of some of the ones who are supposedly on our side, the doctors and surgeons who say, I'm not going to treat them. I'm here to treat our boys. I'm not here to treat the natives. It was a book with a lot of emotion in it. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what it meant to you to write that book?
Well, of course, it was kind of almost semi-autobiographical, highly fictionalized, of course, because I was a nurse in Vietnam. The particular one you're thinking about, actually, I sort of felt that way, and so did most of the doctors and nurses when we first realized that half of our patients would be Vietnamese civilians who were caught in the crossfire, and some POWs. We felt like we were there to take care of our troops when we first went there. But actually, I got to where I really developed an affinity for my Vietnamese patients and cared a lot about them because I worked with them for 6 months, as opposed to our guys who were medevaced in and out because the rate of infection was so high in the country. And in fact, the doctor who I made rather villainous in the thing was really a very sweet man who, once he discovered what had happened to that patient, and that really was a real incident, although perhaps a bit more dramatized in the book than it was in real life. Once he discovered what had happened to that patient, he was appalled. He just had no idea that a Vietnamese hospital was not the same as an American hospital, and that in fact he was condemning her to death. We tried to tell him that, but he hadn't been in country long enough to realize it. So I do want to say that this was not a horrible person.
That's comforting for me to hear that because it was like, oh, why is he doing this?
But it was still the same result to the poor lady.
Yeah,
But that's one of the hard things about healthcare is you're making life and death decisions all the time. And I was making them at the age of 22. And of course, a lot of the men in the field were making them at the age of 18.
Yeah.
And I think the real villain in the whole thing was the war, and what it did to people. We were talking in the panel yesterday about the absolute morality in a way that's not a hard morality, but it's when you get down to hurting people, like in Annie's books. You're wrong, you get punished, and in a war situation, everybody's punished whether they're doing wrong or right.
Yeah.
And sometimes wrong is rewarded. And I think that colors my fiction, especially since before maybe I was reacting against it, which was why the light fantasy. And now I'm in Godmother, I'm trying to recombine it. I did a couple of books in between, besides the Songkiller Saga, which was actually a little bit like Godmother, and it was a combination of the light and the dark, The Last Refuge and Nothing Sacred, that were also rather like Healer's War in that they were dealing with the complexities of a war. And
But they take place in the future.
they take place in the future, but it's still the same situation.
Okay.
It's still hurting human beings. And in Nothing Sacred, I say, there's good news and bad news about that book. The bad news is I end the world. The good news is there's a sequel. So, and it is quite a bit more upbeat than the original one.
Yep. The yeah, it is more upbeat. That's true. Yeah, that's
Even though half the characters are dead.
yeah. So do you talk to each other about your other works in progress, about what's happening?
To some degree.
Oh, to some degree, yeah.
It's kind of became nice to have your little.
I think she was the first to read The Godmother, and I was the first to read The Dolphins of Pern,
Yeah.
since we finished them at her house.
More or less simultaneously.
More or less simultaneously.
Okay, so you're working on multiple projects at the
Yeah.
same time. You'd be working on that and working on the power play, and working on these all at once.
Yeah.
And now, what do you have next in the works? So Power Play is just finished.
I have just finished a book that is a working title of Catani, which expands a short story I did called The Thorns of Baravi.
Okay.
And I just turned that in literally the Friday before I left for the Worldcon.
Now, is that set in?
It's in a new universe.
New universe.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. New material, new people.
Good. That'll be exciting because you've written in such a variety of settings. There's the Rowan and all of those, and
There are 9 of them all told.
Right, 9 different ones. Okay,
9 different
yeah,
ones,
there's
yeah.
a lot, and you collaborate quite a bit with different authors.
Yes, I had ideas that I wanted to continue, in, for instance, the Dinosaur Planet group, and also in The Ship Who Sang, but I didn't have the time. So I was approached by Bill Fawcett, and he said, look, some of the mid-list authors are having a rough time. It's cheaper for a publisher to buy a new author than it is to pay a mid-list author what they should be getting. Maybe if we combined authors, it would help.
Yeah.
So I said, sure. And I worked with Elizabeth Moon, Jody Lynn Nye, Margaret Ball, Mercedes Lackey,
Yeah, you worked with
Elizabeth
a number
Moon,
of good
and
authors.
Steve Sterling. So we managed different voices and different perceptions. And this is very good for both of us because we learn from each other.
So you take that back into your solo work too.
Yeah. Well, yes, it is learning.
Yeah.
One of the most obvious differences between our collaboration and theirs was that we were making up a whole new world.
And in the same house, so we could argue.
The
Right.
the other worlds were
We
Anne had already made up.
We had and we had an outline of what would be good in the novel that they could go on with, and they would insert some of their own ideas, and some of them were quite good.
Whereas your collaboration was
It's
really
50-50.
starting from the ground up.
Yeah.
We said, what shall we do? Anne said, oh, I don't know, the Irish and dog sleds. I said, okay, let's see what we can do.
Hers were the polar bears.
That worked out really well. I mean, Hennepin, it's such, not only the fact, well, I guess the fact that it's a sentient planet it has to do with why it's such an interesting planet, but that's very clear.
Yeah, cut gouging me out, please. Stop blasting parts of me up.
Yeah.
Couldn't you go a little quieter on top?
Yeah.
Well, my share of the inspiration, I think, started with the Joseph Campbell, not Joseph Campbell, but Bill Moyer's Spirit in Nature program, where he was interviewing all of these wonderful, wild-thinking religious leaders and thinking, what if we perceived God differently? Would we perceive Earth differently? Well, no, we don't like to do religion particularly.
Right.
So I said, well, okay, what if it isn't God at all? What if it's just another being, a good being, a kindly being, but a being? And Anne said, yes, that sounds like.
Right.
Occasionally it gets a bit heavy-handed, and it didn't realize that the people were so frail and couldn't withstand some of the
Right.
conditions they were in. So that accounts for it. But those that it did like, it would try to foster and improve their conditions.
If it knows what they need, it tries to help.
Yes.
And then, on the other hand, I've got to tell this about power play. we have a group that decides that they don't care what the people on the planet think, they're going to worship it anyway. So they name themselves things like Sister Igneous Rock and Brother Shale. And toward the end, we, when we're trying to figure out a way to bring, accommodate more people on the planet's surface, Sister Igneous Rock is sitting with a book in one of the planet's communion caves going, now, you see this channel here? Do you think you could do one of those over there? So that's how they end up.
We ended up calling them the rock flock.
So do you, this is just a little point, but do you well, maybe not little to the people on Petaby, but overcome the problem of their not being able to leave the planet without dying?
Well, yeah, we've worked on that one. We've worked on that one, yeah.
So there might be a 4th book coming, or is this?
It's a possibility.
Okay. Haven't closed off all the lines there.
Oh, no, not at all.
That's good. Let's see.
Oh, by the way, I'm getting inspiration from the process, because the second Godmother that I'm working on now is set in Ireland.
Okay.
So that's kind of interesting.
With some characters that carry over, or?
With some characters that carry over. Snow is going to Ireland with Felicity to study godmothering for a number of reasons. One is that Ireland has a lot of what do I want to say, socially conscious programs in effect. Anne was telling me yesterday something like they do more world aid per capita than any country in the world.
Ireland, the wonderful river dance they did for the Eurovision Song Contest was such an outrageous success that they have produced it as a 15-minute, 16-minute tape, videotape, and they're selling it, and all proceeds are going to Rwanda. Now, Ireland is a small country. We only have 4.5 million. But the figures for donations to Ethiopia were 4.5 million, whereas the German Federal Republic, which is one of the richest countries in Europe, gave $100,000. And Ireland knows famine.
Yeah.
And they give more generously per capita than any other country in the world, including the United States, which is not far behind.
Yeah, that's amazing now. And I think you're right that when people experience something, it becomes real for them.
Well, it's an ethnic memory. They remember hunger.
Yeah, and so they think.
And in fact, something interesting in the history, Anne's sister-in-law and I were talking about this, the Choctaw Indians were a part of the Trail of Tears. We always hear about the Cherokee, but the Choctaw and the Cree and several other tribes also were on the Trail of Tears. And they remembered their pain from the Trail of Tears so much that when the potato famine came, they sent relief to Ireland. And so they have a special relationship with...
Kind of like sister nations.
Yeah,
yeah. The I was asked to ask you, and I'm interested in this too, as someone who works with children and young adults, if you have any notions about why it is that kids are so fascinated with the science fiction and fantasy.
Star Trek, Star Wars. Also, they do grab kids' imaginations. It's not the usual, quote, literary type thing that they're required to read. In fact, when I found out that Dragon Song was on quite a few school reading lists, in fact, required reading, I was worried because I never read any of the books on my standard reading list, and I didn't want mine to be in that category either. But from what I've heard of young people who come for signings, no, they read all of them and then go on to the adult books.
Yep.
Well, I started reading science fiction when I was in school because that was back during the Cold War, and we were having all those air raid drills and things. And when we were actually assigned a couple of science fiction books for reading, and I said, oh, they think there's going to be a future. They think there's going to be a world after this one.
I take it you weren't reading On the Beach then.
Actually, On the Beach was one of the books I read, but there was an afterwards.
Yeah.
And there was an afterwards in, oh gosh, I even forget what the books are, but that's a big thing in science fiction is what happens after the end of the world. And Last Refuge was sort of my version of where it takes up again. But I always thought that, exploring space and so on was a good option, because one reason we are so mean is that we're so packed in together. And I think fantasy has a natural appeal because of the fairy tales. And if you want to know why fairy tales have so much appeal to kids, I mean, there's books and books of psychology about that.
Sure,
And
perennially.
also in the past 15, 20 years when we still had the Cold War, and there was great concern that someone would be silly with a button. Science fiction was talking about all kinds of futures, and it gave the adult reader the hope that, gee, maybe there is one. It might not be this one, but if these people are so busy writing about futures, we've got to have one too.
Yeah.
Something else is on this planet now. So much has been discovered and so much has been explored that there are very few mysteries, you know,
Right.
like
Few
you can go in
frontiers.
and find the old elephant burial ground. You know, you
Right.
can't do that anymore. It's,
Under the ocean.
it's there, and
or-
there's probably
yeah.
a war in the middle of it, and there's probably a whole bunch of people trying to preserve something and other people trying to poach it.
Or somebody else living on top of it
Or somebody
already.
else
Yeah.
living on top of it, and talking about space exploration or time travel or whatever gives you an opportunity to still have adventures,
The frontier.
to have real adventures, another frontier. And
Yeah.
we don't have very many frontiers anymore, and we're beginning to wonder if we ought to explore them if we did have.
Yeah.
And I think people need frontiers. So we have frontiers for your head. You know.
The sea is another frontier, and Betty Ballantyne, who was one of my earliest publishers, has done a marvelous book called Secret Oceans, which I would like to plug as another frontier, the one left to us.
They should have written it in collaboration and had Anne's Dolphins of Pern and Betty's come out at the same time. They're
Okay.
very.
So it's Betty
Very
Ballantyne,
companionable.
The Secret Ocean.
The Secret Ocean, yeah, and it's
Okay.
a beautiful book.
That's and that's just out now.
It's just out. It's well researched.
Okay.
The artwork in it is spectacular.
This is
It is,
nonfiction.
it's beautiful.
No, it's a story combining all the areas.
Okay.
And whales know history.
It's a little on the order of Dinotopia, except it's about
Okay.
real creatures.
Okay, well, it sounds like marvelous fun. It's been wonderful having you here today. I've enjoyed it, and I hope that everybody goes out and catches up on some of my favorite recent reading. Thank you so much for coming to Minneapolis.
Thank you very much
Thanks,
for having
Kate.
us on the show, Kate.
You're welcome. This has been a discussion with Anne McCaffrey and Elizabeth Ann Scarborough. Thank you for joining us.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.